Hello, friends. This is the Netarts Friends Church podcast. We are Jesus people, Kingdom of God people, welcoming, yearning, sharing. And we're glad you're connecting here with us. We'd love to connect in person as well. If you're inclined to support this podcast or for more information, just hop on over to netartsfriends.org. That's netartsfriends.org. Let's jump into today's sermon. The words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Plain, Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 27. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, speak well of those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Now, we are going to spend the next 2 Sundays with these words of Jesus. And next week, our focus will be much more on giving to those who ask. But this week, the story of Le Chambon. During the height of World War II, the French village of Le Chambon survived 4 years of German occupation. During those 4 years, something extraordinary happened. The village of Le Chambon became a community of resistance. They became known as the City of Refuge. Jewish people and minority refugees of all kinds were fleeing the Nazis, and they were trying to make their way to safety. And during those 4 years, this small village was able to offer a sanctuary to thousands of refugees. They partnered with local school teachers, city mayors, Quakers, and others who created an underground railroad of sorts to give these refugees safe passage to England and elsewhere. All of this took place right under the nose of German forces. At the center of the story lies a church in the village, a team of 13 church leaders, and a pastoral team, Andre and Magda Trocme and Edward Thies. This community's story includes daring escapes of hiding and transporting refugees, and in some ways, reading this story feels more like a faraway hero's epic of some kind. It's just hard to imagine this story happening in a small community like ours. It's hard to imagine our community secretly housing over, say, 50 to 100 different refugees every single month. Imagine the first night that you take a refugee into your house. Now you're endangering yourself. You're endangering your own family. If the refugees are found in your home, they won't be the only ones shot. or shipped off to a concentration camp, it will be you as well. Imagine this. Imagine tonight your home, this refugee family or person is going to be in your crawl space, in your hiding space in your house. Tomorrow night we might need to put them up in someone else's barn. Then we're going to put them in someone else's basement. Imagine that you are the one feeding them, clothing them, caring for their medical needs, planning, networking, making connections for their next place of safety and travel and beyond. It's hard to imagine doing all of that without a cell phone. All of your communication, all of your planning has to happen right under the noses of the German Gestapo. And imagine you aren't just doing this for 1 month. Imagine we are doing this for over 4 years. But while we are doing it, we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know that it's going to be 4 years. It's just happening. It feels like a miracle that the village of Le Chambon wasn't violently crushed, like other French villages who opposed German forces. When all of the dust settled, the estimates say that the village of Le Chambon had made a life-saving difference for anywhere from 2,500 to 5,000 people who otherwise would probably have been killed while fleeing or died in a concentration camp. And what's striking about Le Chambon's story is that they never set out to put their name on the map. They never set out to do anything extraordinary. They didn't set out to resist Nazism. They weren't particularly political. They didn't have a political agenda. So how did this happen? Well, at the point that the German forces came banging on the doors, the people of Chambon were already steeped in the teachings of Jesus. They were well practiced in loving their enemies, and they had been for quite some time. Their pastor, André Trocmé, believed that Jesus' commands about nonviolence and loving your enemies needed to be obeyed as early as possible if they were to be obeyed effectively. His fellow pastor, Edward Thies, later reflected that if Le Chambon hadn't been practiced in loving their enemies and valuing all human life, what they attempted under the nose of the Nazis would have been suicide, because their alternative community would have fractured and betrayed one another. André Trocmé understood that it wasn't enough to be reactive in condemning various forms of violence and oppression. He believed that habits and character and patterns must be formed within the people of Le Chambon long before the Nazis were banging on their doors. André Trocmé's fellow pastor, Edward Thies, said that nonviolence must have deep roots and strong branches before it can bear the fruit that it bore in Le Chambon. Le Chambon became a city of refuge because long before the war began, they had become convinced by the teachings of Jesus that all human life is of infinite worth. Human life has no price, only dignity. And so when terrified refugees began showing up at their doorstep asking for help, the townspeople were already steeped in the teachings of Jesus. They understood that turning these refugees away would not simply be an act of refusal, it would be an act of harm doing. So, whatever their excuse might be for not taking in a refugee, like I'm protecting my family or I'm obeying the law, from the point of view of that refugee, a closed door would be an instrument of harm doing. And because of Jesus, they had come to see all harm doing as evil. Former child refugee Elizabeth Koenig Kaufman said, "Nobody asked who was Jewish and who was not. Nobody asked where you were from. Nobody asked who your father was or if you could pay. They just accepted each of us, taking us in with warmth, sheltering children, often without their parents, children who cried in the night from nightmares." So, a discussion question, or if you're connecting online, a reflection question if you're not listening or watching with someone else. The leaders of Les Chambon believed that habits, character, and patterns must be formed within people long before a crisis is banging on their door. Can you think of an example where the response that came out of you was a result of something that had become a part of your habits, character, and patterns much earlier? It might be positive or negative. Tell us about it. Jesus said, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also." In all the writing of Christians in the first 300 years of the church, all the church fathers and mothers, guess what Bible verse is quoted more than any other? It's this one. It is Jesus' command to love your enemies. Love for enemies is what separated Christians from everyone else. The ancient Christian Tertullian said, "To love friends is the custom for all people, but to love enemies is customary only for Christians." The early Christians had a whole lot of stuff that they did not agree on in those first 300 years. They were diverse and scattered and still hammering out what they believed. They did not agree on the humanity and the divinity of Jesus. They did not agree on how you should baptize someone, or the Trinity, or women in leadership, or how to observe the Sabbath, or what books of the Bible they thought were inspired scripture. There was a lot that they didn't agree on, but there was one thing that they all agreed on. Christian leaders from across Israel, Egypt, Rome, North Africa, Asia Minor all agreed that Christians should never use violence. They should never kill, not in self-defense, not in war, not as capital punishment. Killing was always wrong. Now, fast forward to today. Whenever these words of Jesus come up, love your enemies, I've observed a couple different ways, a couple different moves that people do. They hold Jesus' words at arm's length. And by the way, as I bring these up, this is a confession. I have done both of these moves that I'm about to describe to you. So these two moves that I'm about to describe might at first sound like complete opposites, because one of them usually ends with someone saying, "Well, actually violence is the solution," and the other move usually ends by someone saying, "No, violence is not the solution." But both of these moves can be a way of holding Jesus' words, Jesus' teaching, at arm's length. So, here are the moves. First of all, one way to hold Jesus' words at arm's length is to move the conversation almost immediately into hypothetical life and death scenarios. So Jesus says, love your enemies, and some people immediately start talking about, well, what should we do if we have an attacker at the door? Or what if the US breaks into civil war and chaos ensues? Or what if a crazed gunman comes to a Sunday service and opens fire? Or what if there's a terrorist attack? And on and on. People come up with all kinds of different examples where they argue that perhaps violence is the best solution in a given situation. And that situation is almost always something that they are not currently living in. And almost always the enemies that they are talking about potentially shooting in this hypothetical situation are actually imaginary people who they don't know. So that's one way to hold Jesus' words at arm's length. But there's another way. Another way to hold Jesus' words at arm's length is to move from Jesus' words, love your enemies, to condemning various forms of real violence and oppression in the world. Instead of moving the conversation to a world of hypotheticals, the conversation can get moved far away by talking about things that are happening across the globe, in another continent, another culture, worlds away. Like those people over in Israel and Gaza or Russia and the Ukraine really need to figure out how to love their enemies. And they talk about all of the atrocities that are happening. Now, I want to make sure that you don't mishear me. I have done both of these moves, and please don't hear me saying that all conversations about hypothetical life and death scenarios are wrong, because they aren't. And please don't hear me saying that concerns about violence and atrocities happening in faraway places don't matter, because they do. And there is a time and a place to condemn genocide and to say, this is absolutely wrong. So please don't hear me saying that either of these conversations just shouldn't happen. That's not what I'm saying. I'm noticing something, however, about both of these moves, either moving the conversation to hypothetical situations or condemning real violence far away. Both of these moves shift the conversation away from what it might mean for you to love your enemies, do good to your enemies, speak well of your enemies, pray for your enemies, the difficult people who you rub shoulders with every day. Whatever you think Jesus means when he tells you to love your enemies, I am not sure that you will ever figure it out or live it out by wrestling with hypotheticals and whether or not it's okay to shoot imaginary people or by condemning violence elsewhere. I believe that Jesus calls you and me to learn this and live this with real people in real life right now. Jesus isn't talking about your hypothetical enemies in the future. He's talking about your enemies right now, and learning to love them is going to be messy. The person who's probably going to learn the most and change the most in the process probably isn't your enemy. It's probably not someone else. It's probably you. Notice when Jesus said, love your enemies, he didn't describe the enemies that you're called to love as attackers at the door or people who are trying to crucify you and torture you and kill your family and burn your house down and pillage your village and commit genocide and war crimes throughout the land and the worst villains you can imagine. Jesus didn't launch into the most intense, high-level hypothetical scenario that you can imagine. He described the enemies that you're called to love as people who hate you and curse you and mistreat you and slap you and take your coat. And those experiences sound like something that might happen to you at a school recess while the teacher isn't watching, more than something that might happen if you're living in an active war zone. So why? Why does Jesus call people to love their enemies and then make those enemies sound so docile? Well, for the same reason that your first rock climbing lesson isn't, hey, let's go free solo El Capitan in Yosemite with Alex Honnold, or your first driving lesson isn't, hey, we're going to plop you in the middle of a Indy 500 race. And your first time riding a horse isn't in the Kentucky Derby. And you don't take your kid for their first bike ride to the bottom of the Grand Canyon and back. Jesus knew that learning to love your enemies, yeah, it could eventually bring you to the most daunting and challenging experience of all experiences, the Mount Everest of enemy love, forgiving and praying for people who are in the middle of crucifying you. Jesus knew that. Jesus eventually talked with his disciples about following him to the summit of enemy love. He said, whoever wants to be my disciple must take up their cross and follow me. But Jesus also knew that the starting place for learning to love your enemies, it's not the hypothetical Mount Everest situation with hypothetical villains. The starting place for learning to love your enemies is loving real people who are in your life right now. To circle back to the story of Le Chambon, if Le Chambon hadn't been practiced in loving their enemies and valuing all human life, what they attempted under the nose of the Nazis would have been suicide. They believed that Jesus' commands about nonviolence, loving your enemies, needed to be obeyed as early as possible if they were to be obeyed effectively. None of us knows what we might actually do in a Mount Everest situation of enemy love, an attacker at the door, a shooter in the church, in the school, civil war, terrorist attack, you name it. We don't know exactly how we'll respond, but if you are willing to take Jesus at his word and practice what he tells you to practice, those intense questions of loving your enemies will figure themselves out by the help of the Holy Spirit. It's kind of like the old 80s film, The Karate Kid. The sensei, Mr. Miyagi, tells the main character, Daniel, to paint a fence and sand the deck and wax his car, and Daniel gets really mad. He doesn't feel like he's learning anything. He can't see how anything he's doing is effective at all, and he wants to quit. What Jesus calls us to practice feels similar. It feels like, how in the world could these actions help anything? How could this be the solution? Love your enemies, do good, speak well of them, pray for them, turn the other cheek. But the more time that I spend looking at Jesus' description of the enemies we're called to love, the more convinced I become that the enemies Jesus wants you and me to learn to love are most likely people who live in your house, and you're probably related to them. You might even be married to them. They live on your street. They go to your school. You see them at work. You sit with them at church. They live in your community. They are the people you rub shoulders with all the time. I think the first enemies Jesus' disciples learned to love weren't Roman soldiers or even Jewish Pharisees. I think the training wheel enemies that they learned to love were the people sitting across the room. Across the room every day, other disciples who were massively different from them. Jesus describes the enemies that you are called to love as people who hate you and curse you and mistreat you and strike you. So let's explore that just a little bit. Can you think of anyone who hates you? Now, you might think of hate as a pretty strong word, someone who's hostile towards you or regards you with ill will. And yeah, that is certainly a part of what Jesus is getting at, but that's not all that hate is. The primary meaning of the word Jesus uses is they don't like you. Can you think of anyone who you'd say, they just don't like me? Or at least sometimes they don't like me. Hate can also mean they love you less than other people. They disregard you in some way. Who was the last person to treat you like you were just less important to them than you thought that you were? Like you said, wow, I guess I'm not much of a priority to them. Or cursing. Can you think of anyone who cursed you recently? Cursing involves causing injury or harm by means of statements and words, and they're words that are specifically intended to harm, not just, oh, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, but intended to harm. Who was the last person to cuss you out, ream you out, tear you down, say something that really maligned your character, something negative about who you are? Or can you think of anyone who mistreated you? Who was the last person to insult you or talk down to you? The last time someone threatened you, no matter how thinly veiled? When was the last time someone harassed you? Or the last time someone was talking about you behind your back, falsely accusing you? Who in your life is just, they're a bully. They throw their weight around and they're intimidating. Can you think of the last time someone struck you on the cheek? In the ancient world, that was a symbol of ultimate dishonor. It was treating you as less than. It was a dehumanizing thing. But that word strike, it's not only a physical word, it can also mean to cause serious harm in a psychological sense. To harm, to injure, to wound, to thump, to shock the senses, the conscience. Who was the last person who broke your heart, broke your trust, left you just feeling kind of shocked and wounded? Is this bringing anyone to mind, any experiences to mind? Who are the people who've hurt you in deeper ways than anyone else? For a lot of people, when they answer that question, they are naming someone who they know or someone who they used to know, at least. Whoever just came to mind, these are the enemies that Jesus wants you to learn to love. Jesus' command about learning to love your enemies needs to be obeyed as early as possible if the command is to be obeyed effectively. So here's the question. Whoever you were just thinking about, when was the last time that you had warm regard for that person? When was the last time you took interest in them and asked them a genuine question? When was the last time you cherished something about them? When was the last time you felt genuine affection for them and demonstrated that not just with words, but with generous actions? When was the last time you manifested concern for that person? When was the last time that you did something beneficial for them? When was the last time you gave them a genuine gift, like something with real thought and care behind it? Have you ever gone through your worldly goods and chosen something truly valuable and useful to you? Something high quality that you own, something that you will miss not having, and as an act of obedience and freeing your heart, have you ever given it to that person who you are thinking of right now? When was the last time you held that person in high esteem? It's easy to cue in on opportunities that tee you up to say some kind of a put down about that person or something negative about them, some little tidbit of gossip. But can you remember the last time you spoke well of that person and praised them behind their back? Can you recall the last time you offered that person words of appreciation and celebration to their face? When was the last time you treated them with kindness? When was the last time they did something biting or hurtful and you didn't retaliate? You didn't defend yourself? When was the last time you prayed for them? What I just outlined is simply a picture of the breadth of what it means to love your enemies, to do good, to speak well of them, to pray for them, to turn the other cheek. This is Jesus, like Mr. Miyagi telling us to go paint the fence and sand the deck and wax the car. It's not just a question of, well, did you do one of these things one time? Because this isn't box checking. Jesus is offering us a new way of life. And the question is, are you engaging this way of life, these practices so regularly that they have begun to change you and somehow become a part of who you are? In what way have these practices become your new way of life? We live in a world that's constantly pitting the value of one human life against another human life. Immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, unborn babies, soldiers, policemen, Black people, Latinx people, Democrats, Republicans, white people, gay people, straight people, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Palestinians, Israelis, rich people, poor people, on and on and on. All human life is of infinite worth. But that truth can only get inside of us and truly change us if we're willing to start with the training wheels that Jesus starts us on. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. So here's the end game. It's to write a reflection, but it's not, well, what's Aaron telling us to do? And it's not even, well, what should I do? Because we aren't coming to these words with a should. It is, how is Jesus calling you to lean into this teaching on loving your enemies this week and beyond as something that you can receive, as an embrace, as Jesus releasing you from something you really do need released from? What is Jesus inviting you to receive? What is Jesus inviting you to give? What are the practical steps that Jesus is inviting you to take? And with whom? What people?
Thank you for joining us for a Sunday sermon from Netart's Friends Church. We hope you'll join us soon for one of our in-person worship gatherings. For more information, hop on over to netartsfriends.org. God's peace be with you, friends.